Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Luke McIntyre, and you are listening to the vertical discourse of God and Kings. Words the glory of God to conceal a matter and the honor of kings to seek it out. Hope you are doing well. Look, it's been a while. There's just been a lot of stuff going on in my own personal life. There's been some things going on with social media. There's been things going on with work. I haven't had the opportunity to sit down and do the podcast the way that I want to. But I do want to go ahead and jump back into this and pick up where we left off probably about a month ago, and that was talking about Jacob and Esau. There's a very distinct relationship between them that does not end after they leave the house of Isaac. But we have to understand where it starts in the house of Isaac so we can follow it in the subsequent generations. So I want to talk about two things that we left off with. First, obviously, Jacob taking the blessing by the direction of his mother, Rebekah. She told him to disguise himself as Esau, which he does. He gets the blessing. And the blessing basically says that he will have the fruitness of the land, nations will serve him, etc. Again, words matter. Isaac's not just giving some blessing that he can give to anybody. He's like, no, I say something, my word stands. If I give this blessing to you, I'm not giving it to someone else. He said that your brothers will serve you. Well, who is that? That's Esau. Esau comes back. Obviously, he's frustrated when he finds out what happens, and he asks, is there any blessing for me? Isaac tells him that he will live away from the fatness of the land. Well, why? Because I gave the fatness of the land to your brother. You will serve your brother until you break his yoke off your neck. So an interesting thing happens after that. Esau is obviously livid. He obviously hasn't made a bunch of great decisions up to this point. So he makes a vow that he is going to kill Jacob. Again, words matter. They didn't just throw words around back then the way that we do now. If you said something or you did something, it had to stand. In the book of the law, I can't remember exactly where it is. It says that if you make a vow, God holds you to it. If a daughter or a wife made a vow, the husband could come along and say like, no, we're not doing that because he's the head of the family. But if he heard them say it and he didn't interfere, that vow was going to stand. You had one of the judges in the book of Judges who made a vow to God, I don't know why, that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house. It was his daughter. Obviously, he was devastated. She was devastated, but he followed through with that. Joshua, in a moment of a lack of wisdom, made a covenant with these Canaanites, not knowing that they were Canaanites, but now he can't break that covenant, so they are now water bearers for them. Well, fast forward, Joshua's generation dies, other generations follow. What happens? Saul is the king, and apparently he kills some of these people. Fast forward, Saul dies, David is the king, and there is a plague on the land. David asks God why. He says, because of the iniquity of Saul for killing these people. Joshua made a covenant, even though I didn't want him to, but he has to honor my word, and this plague is on the land until you take away the iniquity by killing the rest of Saul's descendants. Words and covenants matter. So if Edom has made a vow to kill Jacob, we can't just look at their individual lives. We have to look at the blood of their descendants, because iniquity is in the blood. Life is in the blood, right? There are things about us that live on after us through our posterity. That's the first thing, looking at the blessing. The second thing that I want to look at are some of the choices that Esau made in regard to his wives, and two of them specifically. One of his wives was named Aholibama, the other one was named Ada. I want to focus on these specifically because they had Nephilim blood in their veins. Esau leaves the land of his father and goes to the land of Mount Seir. So we already see him dwelling away from the fatness of the land. We know that he lives in the land of Mount Seir, but Seir was a Horite, and the word Horite there actually means hairy, which is interesting because Esau's known for being hairy. He marries these women, and his descendants actually end up becoming perpetual enemies of the children of Israel in following generations, right? So we have the Amalekites because one of Esau's sons was Eliphaz. Eliphaz had a son named Amalek. Now, Amalek is believed in a lot of commentaries to be the progenitor of the Amalekites, and maybe he was a great leader or so on and so forth. But the Amalekite race did not start with Amalek because they are already mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 14 in the 4 Kings verses 5. Another problem that we see is that Numbers 24 refers to the Amalekites as the first among the nations. So how are they first among the nations even before any of the other nations mentioned in the table of nations in Genesis 10, right? So there are some scholars that believe that the Amalekites were the survivors of an antediluvian race. And some people even believe that the word Amalek is a derivative of the word Lamech, who lived around the time of the days of Jared when the Watchers came down. And again, these are things we can't verify because we don't necessarily have all the sources, but there's a lot of scholarly articles that argue them, and I don't want to get into all of those right now. And then, of course, there's Jewish culture that says that Lamech had three sons, Jubal, Jabal, and Tubal-Cain, and had a daughter named Naamah. Naamah is believed to have married some angel. Again, cultural heresy, I don't know. Samael, and had two children. One, Samael, and then the other one named Amalek after his father, right? So some traditions purport that the Amalekites are descendants from him. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they came from somewhere and they've got a perpetual hatred for the children of Israel. Some of that obviously probably comes from Esau, but some of it is probably much older as well. The point is, Esau marries into the bloodline of enemies of God. And so now this iniquity is compounding in his bloodline. Is it any wonder then that when the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, they run into these Amalekites who are not only, they don't even fight against them. What the Amalekites do is they incite all the other nations around them against the children of Israel, but they themselves don't even fight face to face. They just use coward tactics, like they'll strike from behind at the rear where the sick are, the infirm, the elderly people, the children are lagging behind. They are not an integral people group, right? I actually heard one pastor refer to them. He said that the Amalekites represent secret sin because it's always the ones that kind of show up when you're not looking, or it's the one that you want to compromise with. And I believe that's an allusion to Saul, because Saul could have killed Agag, but instead he's like, hey, you know what? I won the battle. The horror of bloodshed is over, blah, 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 blah. And because of that, he lost the throne, whereas David didn't play with it at all. So anyway, Esau marries into a demonic bloodline by choice, and that's going to wreak havoc in the children of Israel later. This is why this is important. When you look at the blessing of Jacob and you look at the blessing of Esau, you notice a couple of things. Anytime there is another world power that is the focal point in the Bible, you see one of God's people next to them. In Egypt, you have Joseph. In Babylon, you've got Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I always prefer to just call them by their Israeli names as opposed to their names that glorified the god Nebo. When you get to the Persian Empire, you have Esther and Mordecai. So anytime you've got another world power, God has somebody in place to take care of his people. That's the way he set it up. Now, what's interesting about that is when you see the nation in rebellion or in danger, you see an Edomite. When Saul was the king, you saw Doeg, the Edomite, who killed all the priests of Nob and put the entire city to the sword. Genocide. When you go to Persia, you had Haman, the Agagite, Agagite meaning a descendant of Agag. Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and the Amalekites, as we already established, were the children of Amalek, more or less. And Amalek came from Edom. What do you see? You see an intent for genocide. And there's one more character that I don't want to talk about just yet, but that's Herod the Great, who was an Edomite in the days of Jesus. And what do you see? Genocide. So this desire to exterminate the people of God is still there. This animosity is still in the blood, and we see it at different points. Another part of the prophecy that we see that most of us don't pay attention to is this. As long as Israel is in God's favor, the Edomites are confined to Mount Seir. But when you get to about 586 BC, which is the fall of Jerusalem, you see the Edomites rejoicing, and you actually see them leave Mount Seir and they occupy Jerusalem as their new capital. Ezekiel 35 and 36 are some of the main places that you see it. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir, prophesy against it and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Mount Seir, and I will stretch out my hand against you and make you a desolate waste. I will turn your towns into ruins, and you will be desolate. Then you will know that I am the Lord, because you harbored an ancient hostility and delivered the Israelites over to the sword at the time of their calamity, the time their punishment reached its climax. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will give you over to bloodshed, and it will pursue you. Since you did not hate bloodshed, bloodshed will pursue you." Now, the biblical narrative is changing a lot during the time of the Gentile empires. And in some ways, it gets a little hard to kind of follow the progression of what's going on. Like if you're like me, you like being in story mode where I can just read Genesis and then, I can read First Samuel and Second Samuel. I can read the book of Judges and I can just know what's going on. But once you start getting into the times of the kings and some of the prophecies, it gets a little bit harder to follow. Not to mention, there seems to be a gap of the story somewhere between Malachi and the New Testament where people call it the 400 years of silence. The first world empire that we see, and I tend to always refer to that statue that we saw in the dream in Daniel. You have the head of gold, you have the torso of silver, this lower half that starts with bronze, and then the bottom you've got iron and clay, if I'm remembering it correctly. Obviously, the top is going to be Babylon, right? And then you've got Persia. With Babylon, you had Daniel, you had Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael. When you get to Persia, you've got Mordecai and you've got Esther. But you don't really see a whole lot going on with Greece when you go to the Bible. Like, that stuff happened. We all know about Alexander the Great. But the next thing we see is like Rome is in control. All of a sudden, the Israelites are called the Jews. And it's not Judah anymore. It's Judea. And it's not Edom anymore. It's Idumea, right? So there's a lot of name changes. What's going on here? The world is being Hellenized, right? The world is under Greek influence. And this is a big deal because for a lot of us that are trying to follow the storyline, it feels like a bait and switch because it's whiplash if you're trying to make a connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I want to talk about that time period a little bit in order to understand what's going on. And you do have to step outside the biblical narrative because in a lot of ways, the Bible is seemingly silent on some of those things. One of the things that I always reference is Josephus when he talks about the Greeks, because he says that the Greeks changed all the names and accredited to themselves all the works of antiquity to make it sound like they themselves were a people derived from themselves. What does that mean? They basically want to make them sound like they are the pinnacle of all of history. Even now, when you look around and people think about the ancient world, mythologies and things like that, Greece is always at the top, right? And Rome is right there next to it. Why is that? Because the Greeks are Hellenizing the world and they are rewriting history in a lot of ways. We can't trust their version of history. In fact, I can't remember which book in the Bible it is. I believe it might be Titus, where it refers to the Cretans who are also Greece. It says they're always liars. That's not necessarily one of the apostles saying that. He says, I'm quoting one of their own poets. Why does that matter? Because if they're liars, why would you trust their version of history? And yet that's what we run with. The other thing, too, is when we as Christians claim to believe the Bible as the infallible word of God, why then do we accept another version of history that wants to discredit Israel as an empire? Because it was. And I know it seems like we're going all the way around the pasture, just try to get back to this point about Jacob and Esau, but we have to. It's important. So you've got the empire of Greece. You've got Israel over in bondage. You've got the Idumeans coming down and possessing the land. There's a lot of mixture going on in the people groups now, because what you start to see is manipulation by infiltration. There's that old saying that goes, if you can't beat them, join them. This is in The Art of War. It's a tactic of subversion that basically says, hey, we'll just bide our time. We'll make small changes along the way, and no one will be any the wiser for it. So one of the great sagas that you see during this 400 years of silence is the Maccabean Revolution. And that's not just one figure. They're known as the Hasmoneans. The most prominent figure there was probably Judah Maccabee. But another prominent figure that you see is John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus is responsible for conquering the Idumeans in 110 BC. And he told them, hey, if you're going to stay here or if you're going to dwell among us, you have to convert to Judaism. Now, I could try to explain this to you, but I want to read a section from this book. This is from Roots of the Federal Reserve by Laura Sanger. It says, around 110 BC in the land of Judea, the Edomites were forced to convert to Judaism when John Hyrcanus conquered the Idumean cities of Marissa and Dora. This was unprecedented in Israel's history. Never before had a Jewish ruler and high priest forced Judaism upon a conquered people. Not surprisingly, the Idumeans' conversion was ingenuine. In fact, it had deleterious effects on the sanctity of Judaism, the impact of which cannot be underestimated. In the words of Benjamin Friedman, conversions have often proved to be but infiltrations by latent traitors with treasonable intentions. So while they may have converted on the surface, it's ultimately a ruse, right? So we've got the Edomites and the Israelites coexisting together, and so much is about to change. During this period in history, there was an admixture of the Idumeans with the Judeans. The Idumeans became known as Judeans to such an extent that Herod, who was Idumean, was given authority by Rome to govern as king of the Judeans. True to their character, the Idumeans used Judaism as a means by which to achieve their goal of dominion over the usurpers of their inheritance, the Israelites. The strategy was to either cast off Judaism in favor of Hellenism or pervert it into a false Judaism. The Idumeans fit the description of whitewashed sepulchres. When you talk about the whitewashed tombs, who are we referring to? We're referring to the Pharisees, right? We're referring to these individuals who claim to have a form of godliness, but they obviously don't seem to care anything about the average person. We are talking about the people who know the law, but they are willing to argue and not even understand the role of Jesus when he shows up on the scene. In fact, there are certain commentaries, this one included, that purport that the Pharisees that came along were really the blueprint for what you would see in Babylonian Talmudism that would follow later on. Like when you get into writings like the Midrash and things like that, and they basically want to completely illegitimize the work of what God said in the Torah and overturn it with writings that are completely contrary to it. All of this happened because instead of casting out the enemy, they tried to live peacefully. Was that such a bad thing? Well, yeah, it was in the Old Testament. Right? God told them to drive out the inhabitants of the land because when you add mixture, sanctity goes out the window. Consecration goes out the window. In fact, to be consecrated means to be separated from everything that would make you unholy. And that's what the Idumeans or the Edomites are doing here. It was the Pharisees that were referred to as a brood of vipers. Well, why is that important? Because if these brood of vipers are indeed Idumeans, it is very possible that these are some of the very Idumeans who have Nephilim blood in them. Now, I do want to make an interjection here. Having Nephilim blood in you does not necessarily mean that you are a Nephilim, and it doesn't mean that you are completely damnable and completely incapable of going to heaven. It doesn't work that way. I know it's easy for us to want to think of things that way, and I believe that there are some characters, sons of pride, Nephilim characters that, yeah, like salvation is not for you as your birthright. But I believe the further down the bloodline that you go, we can't magnify the work of the enemy so much that we would minimize what the blood of Jesus can do. So I think it's interesting that you have this integration of two people groups, Edomites and the Israelites. They're brothers as far as blood is concerned, but now they are becoming mixed into one people, at least this part of the Idumean bloodline. But there's enough distinction that you've got individuals like Herod the Great, who ends up becoming the makeshift king over the Jews. Why? So he can impose his will on the Jews. Again, you see Jewish genocide here at his hands. So there's still an ill will that is intended. The world is being changed under the Greek Empire, and it's kind of being hushed up in some ways. You know, there are even certain books that don't necessarily make it into the Bible or the biblical canon. And this isn't an argument to say that they should be there, but there are some Jewish traditions that we don't see in the Bible or mentioned in the Bible. And so during the Greek Empire, so much of the biblical narrative seems to be quiet, but we've got this infiltration taking place during it. I almost feel like if we could see that infiltration in more real time, we would probably understand things a little bit better. But is there any other place that we see infiltration? Well, we do, because William Beeston in his book, The Edomite Empire, actually shows us that the empire of Rome is none other than the empire of Edom. And that's an astounding revelation when you think about everything that we've just talked about. The Idumeans have already infiltrated the children of Israel as Judeans, saying, hey, we are one and the same, even though we see them ruling over them. But on the other hand, who are their oppressors by and large? It's the Roman Empire. How do we know this? Because the early Jewish Targums actually say where the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra, the places that you see the word Edom, it actually says Rome. It's interesting, too, because when you think about Esau, it talks about him becoming Edom, him becoming red. What do you think of when you see the Roman Empire? You see the color red. They are known for bloodshed. They're known for great atrocities. What was Esau known for? He was known for being a skillful hunter. He's known for marrying into this Nephilim race, right? And guess what? This is the one empire where you don't see a Jewish leader, but you do see Jesus. So where Daniel represented God in Babylon and Esther represented God in Persia, and you had people like John Hyrcanus and Judah Maccabee who were fighters in the Greek Empire. Now you have Jesus, who stands as representative and king of an empire not made with hands, or not made with human hands, and not of this world. That can't be lost on us either. Herod the Great rules Judea with Roman authority. The thing that we can't miss is that Jacob's prophecy was that he would rule over his brothers. And now we've reached a critical time in history where his brother is ruling over him. But we've also reached a place in history where we are getting ready to see the spiritual Israel arise, because circumcision is not of the flesh, it's of the heart. And anyone who follows Jesus is now the true Israel. That was a tactic of salvation that the enemy could not plan for. Now, even though we've made it up to the time of Jesus, this is obviously not the end of the story. There's more that I want to get into, but I want to take some time to organize that and purport that moving forward, because we also have to talk about the history of Israel, the history of Edom after the pages of the scripture. And this is where it starts to get a little dicey, because now you're starting to move toward the common day and the common era. And the more you start to talk about things in regard to race, the harder it becomes to talk about it. Because let's be honest, these things start to fall into the category of being anti-Semitic, which is interesting, because when most people think about anti-Semitic, they're thinking, let me stop. It's a major point, but I don't think I can go into it just yet. I hope you found this podcast helpful. I feel like I was all over the place, but if you have any questions or thoughts, please let me know. Let's keep the conversation going. And yeah, that's all I got. Till next time, take care.